Good morning, LifePoint. How are we doing today? Okay, that's great. My name is Fred, and I'm a pastor here on staff. My information is up on the screen behind me if you want to connect and send an email about what I talk about today. Hopefully it's not controversial, but if it is, just send me an email and share your thoughts. Or if you want to hang out and get coffee, let me know. I like breakfast food, so if you invite me to breakfast, I will go. It doesn't matter who it is, I will go to breakfast with you. But today we're continuing our series called The Making of a Man. We've been looking at what it means for a man to be a man. We're going to talk about what that means here in a minute, because there's no clear definition in our culture today. The title of my message today is Stewardship, and we're going to be looking at what it means to not be an owner of the things we have, but to be a steward of them, okay? And the best imagery I can think of, if you're younger, you know this, is like, anybody here seen Batman? So like Alfred is the butler, right? He's a steward. He takes care of Master Wayne's stuff, right? But he is not in charge. He doesn't own it. So we're going to talk about being either Batman or the butler, okay? It's kind of the main point of what I'm going to say. A steward or an owner of things. And so three things we're asking men to do during this series, all throughout the series, three rhythms that we're going to ask is, number one, go on an adventure. Okay, you have permission to have fun if you're a man. Women, you have permission too. Go have fun. But we're going to have a series of adventures this month. We would invite you to go on an adventure. Hop on the app or go to the Connect Center for more info. Number two, get in a group. We want you to join a men's small group if you're a man, or come to our LifePoint Men Tables event, what Tyler just talked about, coming up June 22nd. There's going to be breakfast, axe throwing, and golf, okay? It's going to be amazing. And then lastly is grow at a retreat. We want you to set aside time in October to come with us to the mountains above Santa Cruz and to have a retreat and to get away. And so to start our time today, I kind of want to offend you a little bit, is you don't own anything, okay? So you don't own anything. You don't own your car. You don't own your house. You don't own your bank account. You don't own your job. And even you don't own your kids, okay? Your kids and everything you have belongs to somebody else. And the reason is we live in a universe where God exists, okay? There's a creator God who's created everything, and he owns everything. And at best, we borrow things as people, okay? And so this is hard for me as a man because I can get very possessive. Anybody out there relate to that? Any men or women? Like if somebody takes my pistachios, I have a breathless moment where I get real, I said, how dare they? Like things go through my mind that shouldn't be in there because I tend to find life in what I possess. And all of us are kind of the same. All of us find life in the things that we possess, in our possessions, in our money, and even hoarding and protecting our time. We find life in those things as opposed to finding life in God. And that's kind of, if we talk about manhood and what a man is, that's one of the differences, is men are supposed to be stewards, not supposed to be slaves, or we're not supposed to obsess over the things that we own. And so the series question that we've been answering, that Tyler answered last week, by the way, Tyler did a great job last week preaching. If you get a chance, go back and watch his message from last week on discipleship. But the series question that we have today is, what makes a man? So what makes a man? Is a man somebody over 18? Are they independent, like financially independent? Are they moved out of their parents' house? Are they able to shave? Any middle school parents in the room are people who are able to shave? Is that a man? If your 14-year-old can shave? No. Okay. But really, what makes a man? Because there's a crisis of manhood. I know you've heard that before, but I was reading a New York Times article, and on the cover, the article was about millennial and Gen Z women are dating older men because they can't find mature men their age. And on the cover was a 20-year-old guy sitting on the edge of his bed in his parents' house. He had a headset on, he had a controller, and he had a massive flat screen TV all within like 4 feet of each other. And that's kind of a picture of the crisis of manhood, is that he's finding identity, and a lot of men find identity in what they possess and what they own. They're not finding identity in Christ and who he is. And so the answer to this, the solution to this, is that the world needs more men, but they need more men who are like Jesus, okay? And that's not just a Christian thing to say. It sounds very Christian you say that, right? Jesus is the ultimate man. If you're a believer, you know that he's the man, right? He's our guy. He embodies God and his generosity, his power, his authority, his mercy, and his grace. Jesus embodies God. and he is the one that is like the true man, okay? And compared to Jesus, all of us feel like kids, okay? Even men begin to look like boys compared to Jesus. And Jesus is the one who shows us what stewardship is, what it means to take care of somebody else's things as if they belong to God, and we don't hoard them and find life in them, and in the end become slaves to them. Because either you're a steward or you're a slave. There's no middle ground. And that might be a strong word, but this is what Romans 6:16 says in the Bible. It says this. It says, "Don't you know that if you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one that you obey, either of sin leading to death or of disobedience or of obedience leading to righteousness." So either we are slaves to sin, and in our context, the stuff that we own, or we are slaves to righteousness. We're stewards of what God has given us, and we are servants of God. And there's really no middle ground. Either we are slaves or we are servants. And that's kind of a hard word for us to hear, because a lot of us aren't there yet. Like a lot of us, for us, we find identity in the things that we own. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But my main point today is we go through Luke chapter 12. We're going to look at a parable. As Jesus is teaching, somebody interrupts him and he shares a parable. But the main point that I want to cover today is that men live to give, okay? Men live to give. We find meaning and purpose and joy and generosity. Any men in the room? You love to give. You love to give your time, your presence, and you love to give your money, and ultimately you love to give your lives, because that's what manhood is being generous and being stewards with what God has given to us. I mean, all of us have seen immature men. Anybody here seen an immature man before in your life? Okay, my wife is raising her hand, I bet. Maybe not. But all of us can be immature, and we've all seen immaturity in other people, right? Like grown people who are acting like they're much younger. But what I want to say is that men live to give. And what we're going to see today is they live to give their presence, like they're relationally present with people. They live to give their time, and they live to give their money. And ultimately, my last point is they live to give their lives. So if you could grab a Bible. We're going to be in Luke chapter 12. There should be some, you might be sitting on, like, this chair is really hard. That's a hardback Bible. Otherwise, it's going to be on the screen behind me. Luke chapter 12, this is the CSB, Christian Standard Bible version. It says this, as we first see that we are called, or men live to give their presence, or their relational presence. It says this. It says, "Someone from the crowd said to Jesus, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.'" So Jesus has been teaching. Thousands of people are trampling over each other to hear his teaching. He's very popular. He's been teaching on some cosmic things about the leaven of the Pharisees, or the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. He's saying, don't be like those guys. Then he goes on to talk about not denying him before people, or he'll deny you before the angels in heaven, saying there's judgment for denying him. So there's like some big cosmic things. And in the middle of this dude just starts to stands up and shouts out this personal request. And this is Jesus' response. Verse 14. He said, "Friend," he said to him, "who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" He then told them, "Watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not found in the abundance of his" what? Possessions. Okay. So Jesus, like I said, he's teaching, and he's not teaching about, hey, you guys should like give me everything that you have, and I'm so amazing, I'm so great. He's talking about a kingdom thing, big cosmic things. And if you don't know Jesus could be very personable with people, but he also taught about true cosmic realities of heaven and hell, of sin, of righteousness, of living for God, and things like that. And he's having one of those messages, and out of nowhere, this guy interrupts him, not with a question like, "Oh, teacher, explain this mattered to me more deeply." He said, "Hey, I want you to settle my estate with my family." And what was happening is his brother was probably the older brother. Older brothers got 2/3 of the estate when a father passed, and the younger brothers would split up the last 1/3. If you notice, this guy doesn't cry out, "Hey, Jesus, I'm struggling. My dad just died, and my brother won't talk to me." He's not asking for relational advice. What does he want? He wants his money. He wants his inheritance. And that probably was land and money, probably a combination of those two things. And Jesus responds to this guy who's not doing this in a good way by calling him what? What does he call him? He calls him friend. Right off the bat, he says friend, which is a very gracious thing for Jesus to do, because this guy just interrupted in front of thousands of people to talk about a personal matter. He calls him friend. he says that it's not his job to make him wealthy. He says, it's not my job to arbitrate over your estate and over your inheritance, even though some rabbis would do this. That's why the man asked Jesus. And for us, it's not Jesus' job to make you wealthy. I hope we all understand that. If you don't know Jesus, you probably understand this really well, is that God's job is not to give you money, it's to give you life, right? But this man cries out for it. And then lastly, Jesus calls him greedy, okay? And he gives him a warning that life is not found in the abundance of one's possessions. Because again, this guy could care less about his brother and about his father who just died. He wanted his money. So when my grandmother died, she died before I was born. My father became the trustee of the estate. And he had two brothers. In the estate, there was money for college and things like that. And there was also a piece of land in Hawaii worth about $3 million, okay? And the land was supposed to stay in the trust. And eventually they started suing each other to sell this piece of land. And about 10 years later, they sold the land. They each got about $1 million. And they've long since spent that money. And you know what happened? They no longer talk to each other, okay? And that's an example of finding life in possessions and in what we can get and what we can gain. And this advice from Jesus isn't really advice. When he says life is not found in the abundance of your possessions, he's not saying, hey, hey, guy, if you could just to hear me out, this would be really good advice if you could just, he's warning this young man to stop. Does that make sense? This guy is on this track of obsessing over wealth and getting more and even getting what's rightfully owed. And Jesus warns him that it's not going to end well. It's in fact going to end badly for him. And that's why he says, hey, life is not found in the abundance of your possessions. And he's going to go on and he's going to share a story about a parable about a man. But I think the question becomes is if we're not supposed to find life in our possessions, how do we relate to our stuff, right? Like, how do we relate to the stuff that we own? And the answer is you don't, okay? You don't relate to your stuff. So you married a woman if you're a man and married. You didn't marry a car. Is that fair? You relate to your kids. You don't relate to a computer. Does this make sense, guys? The reason is you don't relate to material things because they're not eternal. So how many of the things that Jesus interacted with are still here today? Can you go find his house? Can you find the chariot that he rode around in? Even the temple that he walked in, it's been destroyed, and they've pieced together one wall of it, which you can go visit today. Everything that so possessions are not eternal. That's why we don't relate to our stuff. We don't obsess over things, but we do it all the time, don't we? You ever ask a man to borrow his tablet? You ever done that? What happens? Or borrow his computer? All of a sudden, it's like, wait, what do you need my computer for? What do you need this for? And as they're closing windows, right, they're like, hey, what do you want to do on here? What's up with that? They ask you like 20 million questions. Or you want to borrow a man's car? You ever try to do that, right? And then all of a sudden, it's like, wait, what are you talking about? What's wrong with your car? Where's you? And it's like, well, we have plans for that car. It's going to be in our garage on Saturday night, right? Or if you ever try to, heaven forbid, and I don't recommend doing this, saying, hey, can I see your wallet? You might get punched in the face, right? Because we love our possessions. And we relate to them in weird ways. And every man, just to be clear, has something that they secretly relate to that it's really hard for them to let go of. Okay, and that's not to be hard. I know there's things in my life I do this with. Like I watched this guy at Panera Bread last week. Nothing against him. He seemed like a very nice guy, but he was poring over his stamp collection for hours and hours. I was like, man, that guy loves his stamps. He had book after book, and I was very impressed by the amount of stamps that he had. But sometimes we can find identity in our stuff, and we don't relate to our stuff because it's not eternal. Does that make sense? So after this, Jesus continues, and he teaches this parable. I think a couple of us have heard this. Even if you don't know Jesus, you might have heard this principle of the rich fool. So let's continue in Luke chapter 12, and let's see how men live to give not only their presence, like we just talked about, they live to give their time, okay? So it says this in Luke chapter 12, verse 16. It says, then he told them a parable. A parable is a story with a moral or a lesson behind it. A rich man's land was very productive. A farmer's land was very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this, he said. I will tear down my barns and I will build bigger ones to store all my grain and all my goods there. Then I'll say to myself, so this dude's talking to himself, first red flag, right? And I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. So Jesus responds to this young man's greed by telling a parable of greed. And a lot of us think this parable is only about money. It's only half about money. It's also half about time. Okay, so this man has an abundant crop. There's some, we don't know how much, but it might be 3 or 5 or 10 times a normal year's income. And he has 3 options, right? He can either waste the extra crop by not harvesting it, let it just sit there and waste. He can give it away, what's extra, or he can keep it. And which one did he choose? He chose to keep it, okay? And his barns weren't big enough to hold. This was a lot of grain. So he says, hey, I'm going to tear down my barns and I'm going to build bigger barns. And it wasn't so he could build a legacy of generosity in his community and in his family of building wealth, like he's going to follow, Dave Ramsey or something like that. He did it to expend on himself. Do you guys catch that? There's no conversation about kids or community or it's all about him. And just like in Indiana Jones, right? He chose what? He chose poorly, right? Walter Donovan. Okay, if you haven't seen that movie, go and check it out. But he chose poorly. He made a bad decision, and the decision really revolved around how he was going to spend his time. So the last years of his life, he decided to use his time not to serve God or be generous towards God, but to serve himself and even entertain himself. He could eat, he could drink, he could enjoy life. I know a lot of you guys are working really hard, so someday you can retire, okay? And retirement isn't necessarily a bad thing, is it? Like a lot of you guys are like, well, I'm destroying my body now, so someday I can retire and enjoy life. And some of us are working just to be done with work because we don't like time. We don't like managing our time and going to a job, and it kind of drains us emotionally. So if you're a millennial in the room, I know that you've done this before. All of us have hopped on Zillow and checked our home value, right? And we see what we owe if you own a home. If you don't own a home, you can probably understand in other areas. And you start to calculate, hey, if I sold my home, how much money could I make so I don't have to work for the next couple of years, right? Like, hey, I can sell my home, I can buy a van, and I can drive around with my family in a van for 2 years, which is a great way to make the evening news, right? Just don't do that. You'd go crazy. But a lot of us, we don't like time. We don't like managing our time. We don't like working. We want to ignore the progression of time. So this guy was done. He didn't use his time as a resource. He used it on himself, and he used money to avoid managing it. I know, guys, this is probably one of the biggest, like Tyler joked earlier on stage, about having your wife sign you up for the event, because a lot of guys struggle in time management, okay? I'm not calling you guys to point them out, but some of us struggle with that, and usually we struggle with it for 3 reasons, I think. Guys struggle with it emotionally because, number one, we feel regret. Anybody here ever feel regret? Like you did something in your life, you're very intentional about your time, and then it blew up, it didn't work out, and so you constantly feel regret. Some of us feel lonely. Right? We don't want to manage our time because we're still going to be lonely tomorrow. We're still going to be lonely next month. And then thirdly, we do it sometimes because we're hopeless. Like, you ever tried to schedule something with somebody who's depressed, either clinically or not? It is the hardest thing in the world. Like, even imagine trying to schedule something a year out, because for them, it doesn't feel like it's going to get any better. I think a lot of us struggle with time management. A lot of us view time in like this negative thing that it's eventually going to get us, and it's going to cause regret in my life. So when I was 26, I planted my first church. And I was very intentional about how that church was built, starting with a small group of people and then planting other small groups. And then we got a core group together. If you don't know what that is, that's kind of like the foundation of the church. It's a group of 30 people. And then we built out ministries. We began to gather on Sunday. We raised up leaders. And then we were getting ready to plant more churches. But I left that church when I was 32. And after that, I was kind of jaded for a season. I felt that there's a countdown clock to everything in life, to when people will leave you or you will leave them. And by God's grace, He's been able to work on that in my heart and my mind. And there's like this beautiful hope of pastoring a church where you can actually have real friendships and relationships. But at the end of the day, a lot of you guys have been through a lot of things. And usually when a man struggles to manage his time, it's because something has happened and they don't like time. It's emotionally draining, isn't it? To sit down and look at your calendar and say, well, I'm going to do this on this day and this on this day. And the reality is, time for some of us is not a resource. Time for some of us is a curse. It's something that we don't like. But what Jesus is going to imply here in a minute is that time is meant to be leveraged. time is a tool that's meant to be used to glorify God. So there's a reason why, if you know Jesus, he didn't save you and then bring you up to heaven. Do you guys ever think about that? Like, why didn't Jesus just save me and then end my life and bring me up to heaven? That'd be very nice. Like, I just want heaven. I want it now. The reason is because you still have a job to do. So your job is to go and to make disciples and to glorify God, because people around us don't know him. Anybody here know a non-believing friend? Or a son or daughter or cousin? Or man, there's a lot of people who don't yet know the Lord, and they mean so much to us. And I want to ask the question, how much time would you give for one person to come to know the Lord? For one person to be saved, for the eternity of one person to shift? Would you guys give an hour of your time for that? Would you guys give 10 hours? Would you guys maybe give a week? Maybe it's somebody you really love and care about and that you've been praying for years. How much time would you give for them to know and love Jesus? I bet all of us, we'd give our lives just for one person to know and love the Lord. So that's the power of time, isn't it? Is that you've been given time to glorify God, because we're surrounded by people who don't know him. In the cities and the valleys around us, 80 to 90 to 95% of the people don't know Jesus. They don't know his love, they don't know his beauty, and if they died today, they'd face the righteous judgment of God. So time is a resource, guys. It's been given to us to glorify God, to invade every unbelieving heart, every unbelieving home, every unbelieving neighborhood. And the call for women, and especially for men, is to use your time, to manage your time, to glorify God, to talk about Jesus, to serve your neighbor. And the call is to manage time. And a lot of us, we can struggle with that. So let's keep going. The last thing that Jesus talks about is money. And I know for the men in the room, you're like, okay, this is it, right? We're talking about stewardship. You're getting ready for that money conversation, that giving conversation. You're like, I hope Fred doesn't offend me, and I probably will offend you. So I'm sorry about that. But let's let Jesus offend you if that happens, okay? So Luke chapter 12, verse 20, we're going to see lastly how we men live to give their money. It says this, verse 20. So remember, the rich fool, he's got all this abundance, 5-10 times his income. He's decided to hoard it instead of giving it away. And this is God's judgment. It says this, verse 20. But God said to him, you what? You fool. This very night your life is demanded of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? And this is the lesson that Jesus gives at the end. That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So at the end of the parable, this guy gets a visitation from God, okay? So he's made his decision. We can see that it's probably not the best decision, but God shows up and calls him a fool. And a fool, if you call somebody a fool in the Bible, that's one of the worst things that you can call somebody. It means you're unwise, you're unholy, you're ungodly. And God says to him, you fool. He says, this very night your life is demanded of you. I'm ending your life tonight, is what he's saying. And the things that you've collected, the big plans that you've had, what's going to happen to those things? Right? This dude wasn't saving for his kids or to build, like this guy was saving for himself. And this is like every retiree's worst nightmares, where you save, you get ready, it's the perfect time you retire, and then your life is cut short. And God says, hey, who's going to get all that money, all those plans? What's going to happen to these things that you've stored up? And then the lesson that Jesus shares at the end is that this is the result of everybody who doesn't live generously towards God or rich towards God. And so I think for the men in the room, I think when we talk about money, men get emotional about money. Can I say that? Like if you ever see a man upset, there's like a 50% chance he's mad about something he's done with money, or something he's worried about money not coming in, or something's happened to him financially. Money's a big deal. And I think for a lot of the men, when we talk about money at church, it's kind of like that moment of, well, I knew it. Like they just want me to give my money. And the answer is, I do want you to give your money if you know Jesus. I want you to be generous towards God, not because I need job security. I've lost a job before. I know how that works. Not because LifePoint has to be epic. We got to make LifePoint look epic. We need your giving to do that, man. We live next to Lake Tahoe. Compared to that, we are not that epic, right? The reason I want you to give is because life is so exciting when you take a chunk of your income every time you get paid and you give it back to God and say, God, you're all I really have. Everything that I have is yours, and I'm going to give back a part to you. And it's like a risky way to live, but it's also a beautiful and powerful way to live. I remember when I graduated college, my dad sat me down. And he said, hey, we're going to build a budget together. So we built the budget, and I brought it to him. And in there was a line item for tithing or giving. And my dad said to me, hey, I appreciate that, but I think that's unwise. I don't think you should give 10% of it was $400 a month towards giving. Maybe you should work towards that. And I pushed back on him. And by God's grace, my wife and I have been able to give 10% of our income to God. And it's one of the funnest things in the world, to give generously to God and say, God, I'm going to give back to you what you have given to me. And so the question is, well, how do we give, right? Like, is there like when I was younger, when I was a little kid, I thought there was like a mailbox that sent money up to God or letters up to God like Santa, right? And that's not actually the case. You give to God through the local church, okay? And if you're a part of LifePoint, that's LifePoint. If you're a part of another church, that's your home church. But you give to God if you know Jesus through your local church. If you don't know Jesus, we want you to know him. We want to offer him up to you. But the second question that's going to be asked that everybody knows is coming is, well, how much do I give? You guys ever asked that question? And when you ask that question, there's like landmines all around that question. And one of them is probably going to blow up. And the best that I can offer you is we give generously, consistently, and I believe that we are to give at least 10% of our income to God. In the Old Testament, God's people have always given God 10%, what's called a tithe. And that wasn't just like Moses and the law. Like a lot of us say, well, that's like a law. We don't obey laws anymore as Christians. But even before that, since God has had a people with Abraham and his grandson Jacob, God's people have given 10% of what has come into them. And some Christians believe that you give as your heart's decided, and that's totally fine, whatever you decide to give. But I think it starts at 10%, okay? And some of us are like, well, hey, maybe the New Testament has better teaching on that. Well, Jesus corrects the fool for doing what? Not giving his extra income to God. So 10% is a little bit safer than saying 90%, which is what this guy probably should have given to God, abundance, right? And so I think that's a great place to start. And I know for a lot of us, that's a struggle to talk about finances, right? Because a lot of us, we spend our money in certain ways, right? I think how we spend our money says a lot about us. If you looked at my bank statement, which my wife and I do sometimes, you'll see Bodine's breakfast in there quite a bit, right? Or breakfast somewhere else. I love breakfast, and you can ask her after service how much I love breakfast foods. But all of us, our spending reveals what we value, but I would say our withholding reveals even more. Okay? So anybody here ever, when you're in high school, go to a restaurant with high school boys and split a check? You guys ever done this? You go to a restaurant, and I'll explain what this is. You go to a restaurant, and what happens with the high school boys? What do? They order the drinks. Each one of them orders an appetizer. They order their entree. They order a dessert, and they just gorge themselves. But when the check comes, what happens? All of a sudden, they're like, well, my entree was like $8. I'm going to put $5 on the table and run away to the bathroom, right? And that's what they all do. You never want to be the last person at a table with high school boys. But the reality is, it's kind of like us. A lot of us withhold from God when we're called to be generous towards him. We don't want to give of ourselves. And there's reasons behind that. But I want to say this. A life lived for itself is dull. It's boring. There's no great epics about a dude who worked a job, who overate, who overspent, who lies on his taxes, who alienates his friends and his family, who looks at stuff late night on his computer, and then dies alone with $1 million in his 401k. Like Tolkien didn't write that, did he? C.S. Lewis didn't write that epic. That's not a great story. But on the other hand, what about a man who was vulnerable? A man who showed up when his church or his family needed him. A man who spoke tenderly to the God that he believes exists when nobody else is listening. A man who constantly sacrifices, who pushes all of his chips in the middle of the table, including his finances, his time, and his emotional energy. Says, man, I'm going to give it all to you. Like heaven is going to be filled of stories of men and women who've lived lives like that. Won't it? People who've banked everything on Jesus being real. Because when we don't give personally, when I withhold, it's because I doubt God is actually real. I doubt that I doubt that I'm actually forgiven. You guys relate to that? We don't give when we don't believe these things are real, that the gospel is the gospel, the good news of Jesus. We forget. But for all of that, like I said in the beginning, all of us compared to Jesus were like little boys and little girls, okay? And that's not meant to be offensive, but he is the true man, right? Who gives of himself. He shows us that life is found in generosity. Man, well, we argue about like how vulnerable should I be with my small group. If you've never had that conversation, it's going to happen. At some point, you're like, well, what should I share with my small group? Man, Jesus was totally vulnerable on the cross, revealing himself. And so Jesus was crucified naked. If you didn't know that, he was crucified naked. And that was not only a picture of the shame that he took from us, but God's vulnerability in offering up his son so that we might have life. And with that, while we argue about how much to spend on a car, you guys ever done that as a Christian? You're like, well, how much should I spend on a car? How much can I spend on a car without it being excessive? God shows us the value of our life in Christ, that Jesus died, and as Roy talked about earlier, he died for our sin, and he rose to give us life. And while we argue about how much money we should give, like, is it 10%, is it 5%, is it 20%? Jesus gives 100% on the cross. Like he didn't come down here to restore a chariot that his disciples were going to pull him in around. He didn't come to renovate a house. He came to give his life to restore God's children to God. And man, giving generously of your time, money, and energy is one of the best decisions you could ever make. Right? Like when you get paid, giving massive chunks to God and saying, God, I trust you. That's so much fun. When you show up, when you're tired and a friend needs something, or your small group needs something, or the church needs something, or you even show up to the corporate gathering as you guys are now, man, there's power in that. And so my encouragement to you guys is to look to Jesus. Man, Jesus, he is the true man. And all of us are like the little high school boys, right? Who we gorge ourselves, we expend, we rack up such a large bill, and Jesus comes in and he pays our tab, didn't he? Paid our tab on the cross. He forgives us of all of our sin and doesn't just send us away saying, you guys better learn your lesson. He says, hey, come be like me. Come live a life of generosity like me, because he knew that life was found in generosity. So how do we live like Jesus? A couple next steps. First, we use our possessions, or we use our toys to get people, okay? So the possessions that we have, that usually terminates on itself, right? When I first got married to my wife, Jen, I had an Xbox, and I would find myself in the guest bedroom on a Saturday playing Xbox while my wife was sitting in the other room, and I all of a sudden realized, what am I doing with my life, right? I should not be using these things for myself. Instead, use what you have to get relationships, right? To get people. So maybe that's going on an adventure. Like if you have a mountain bike and you've got a body and you know that Pastor Kyle's leading a mountain bike ride, do the math, okay? Get your bike and go ride your mountain bike with Kyle. If you've got golf clubs or you have access to a set of golf clubs, go join Keith and the guys for a day of golf, right? Or another adventure that's coming up is a hike. If you have shoes and a bottle of water, join Charlie and the other guys on a hike, but use your toys to get people, okay? Secondly, use PTO to get away. So some people, a lot of us have paid time off, vacation time. Sometimes we have to take time without getting paid, but make time in October to come to a retreat with us, okay? That's October 11th to the 13th. It's up in the mountains above Santa Cruz. We're going to have fun. We'll do some Frisbee golf and golfing and some other things as well. But make time to get away and to grow at a retreat. And thirdly, use your treasure to get on mission. And this is not a commandment. This is a challenge. If you're a man, I challenge you to give consistently to God, to give him 10%. Just try that. I know some of you guys have extenuating circumstances, fixed incomes. I understand that, man. God will bless anything. But if you're able, try giving 10% and see what God does, man. It's so much fun. It's a blast to give to him and to push your chips in the middle and say, God, I actually believe what I say, and I believe that your son is real. And then lastly, use your time to get busy, okay? So start managing your time. Right? Like begin to budget your time, not just in normal life, but also to make disciples and to connect with other believers. And if you don't know Jesus, man, we invite you to everything at this church. You can come to these men's events, you can come to the retreat and just hear more about who God is and what he has done. But use your time to get busy. So come to the LifePoint Men's Table event, June 22nd. As Tyler talked about, there's going to be breakfast. There's going to be axe throwing. There's going to be we'll be safe. I know the ladies are like, wait, are you going to be safe with that? We'll be safe with those axes. There'll be golf and a couple other things, but join us on June 22nd. So let's bow our heads and let's pray. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for Jesus. He is the true man who pays our bill. His death on the cross paid for our sin. And apart from him, we really don't know what manhood is. I pray, Father, for the men here today who struggle like me in being possessive over the things they own, who struggle financially or even struggle with their time and giving of their time because of what's happened in the past or how they're doing emotionally. I pray that you would help them to be stewards, God, and help me to be a better steward. Help us to have fun and enjoy life and not be an owner, God. We don't own anything. All of it belongs to you. And I pray that at the end of our life, we wouldn't stand before you and to hear the words that we've been a fool. I pray that we'd stand before you and we'd be commended for being stewards. Pray this in Jesus' good name. Amen. All righty, guys. So join us next Sunday as we continue our series on Father's Day, talking about mentorship. So bring a dad. We're going to have some sweet snacks and some sweet food for the dads. And have a great Sunday, and we'll see you then. Thanks.